I'd been a fire inspector for 38 years in Nashville, Tennessee, and in that time I learned one thing above everything else. The most dangerous fires aren't the ones that announce themselves with smoke and noise. They're the quiet ones, burning behind walls you never thought to check, eating through the structure of a building while everything on the surface looks perfectly fine. I should have applied that lesson to my own family. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I spent nearly 4 decades walking through other people's buildings, cataloging risk, writing citations, saving lives they never knew I saved. I retired 3 years ago with a modest pension, a paid-off house in East Nashville worth somewhere around $600,000 on today's market, and what I believed, genuinely believed, was a loving relationship with my daughter. Her name is Carolyn. She's 39, married to a man named Greg Hoffman, who sells commercial real estate and has never once looked me in the eye for more than a few seconds at a time. They have a 4-year-old named Sophie, my only grandchild, and for a long time, Sophie was the reason I kept my mouth shut about a lot of things. My wife, Patricia, passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. After she died, I was the one who needed help getting back on my feet, and Carolyn was there, or seemed to be. She called every day for the first month. She brought meals. She took me to appointments. I told people she was the best daughter a man could ask for. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't know for another 3 years, was that somewhere in the middle of all that grief and gratitude, I had started signing things I shouldn't have signed. It started small. A medical power of attorney, which Carolyn explained was just in case something happened. A financial authorization form that she described as letting her help manage bills while I was too depressed to function. I was too depressed to function. I signed. I didn't read carefully. Patricia had always been the one who read documents carefully. The fall happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the kitchen reaching for a cast iron skillet on the top shelf, and my foot caught the edge of the rug Patricia had always meant to replace, and I went down hard. Left wrist, fractured. 2 ribs, cracked. Concussion, mild but real. The neighbor across the street, a retired postal worker named Don Garrett, saw my back door hanging open through his kitchen window and came over to find me on the floor. He called 911. He probably saved me from lying there for 12 hours. In the ambulance, I called Carolyn. She answered on the second ring, and her first words were not, "Are you okay?" or "I'm coming right now." Her first words were, "How bad is it?" Not bad for whom. Just how bad is it? Like she was assessing damage to a piece of property. I told her what I knew. She said she'd be there as soon as she could get Sophie to the sitter. She arrived at the hospital 2.5 hours later, which I know because I watched the clock on the wall of my hospital room the way you watch a clock, when there's nothing else to do and your wrist is in a splint and your chest hurts every time you breathe. She came in looking stressed, not worried. There's a difference. Worried is about another person. Stressed is about yourself. Carolyn looked stressed. She sat with me for about 40 minutes. She asked the nurse twice in that 40 minutes about my cognitive state, which I thought was an odd question given that I'd fallen in my kitchen, not had a stroke. The nurse, a young man named Tyler with a calm, steady manner, answered her professionally both times. I watched his face. Something flickered there that I couldn't quite name. When Carolyn left, she said she'd check on me tomorrow. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't say she loved me. She squeezed my good hand, told me to rest, and walked out. The door hadn't fully closed before I heard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice dropping low the way it does when she doesn't want to be overheard. I couldn't make out words. I heard tone. The tone was not the tone of a daughter updating her husband about her injured father. It was faster than that, more purposeful. I lay there in the dark after the lights dimmed, and I thought about the last 3 years. About the $30,000 I'd lent Carolyn and Greg for what they called a cash flow gap in Greg's business. About the $18,000 after that for the renovation on their house in Brentwood. About the promissory notes I'd asked for the second time but not the first, because the first time I'd been grieving and trusting and foolish. About the way Carolyn had started using the phrase, "when the house eventually sells," in conversations about my future, even though I had no plans to sell my house. About the medical power of attorney I'd signed without reading. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, Tyler came in early for vitals, and I asked him, as casually as I could, what exactly my daughter had been asking about when she used the phrase cognitive state. He was quiet for a moment, professionally quiet, the way people are when they're deciding how much honesty is appropriate. Then he said, "She asked whether a patient in your situation would be considered capable of making independent financial decisions. She said she was asking for planning purposes." I kept my expression neutral. I'd spent 38 years keeping my expression neutral while writing up citations for building owners who did not want citations written. "Thank you, Tyler," I said. "I appreciate you telling me that." He nodded. "You seem like a sharp guy, Mr. Briggs." He said it simply, without drama, and went about checking my chart. I asked him if I could borrow a phone charger, and when my phone had enough battery, I made 2 calls. The first was to a man named Dennis Ashford, who had been my attorney for 20 years and handled Patricia's estate. The second was to Don Garrett, who answered on the first ring and said he'd been thinking about me since yesterday, and what did I need? I needed 2 things from Don. I needed him to go to my house, find the gray lockbox in my bedroom closet, and bring me the folder inside it. And I needed him not to mention it to Carolyn if she called him. Don didn't ask a single question. He said he'd be there by noon. Dennis Ashford arrived the following morning. I'd explained enough on the phone that he came prepared. We met in my hospital room with the door closed. He spread the folder Don had brought across my bedside tray table. The medical power of attorney, the financial authorization. 2 other documents I barely remembered signing, both dated within 6 months of Patricia's death, both bearing my signature in handwriting that looked like the handwriting of a man who was not fully present. Dennis read through everything slowly. I watched his face the way I used to watch the faces of building owners. When he finished, he folded his hands on top of the documents and looked at me. "The medical POA is limited," he said. "It only applies if you're declared incapacitated by 2 physicians. The financial authorization is broader than you probably understood when you signed it. It gives Carolyn access to your accounts and the ability to act on your behalf in transactions. However," he paused, "it doesn't override your own authority. You're still the primary decision maker as long as you're competent. And if someone tried to argue I wasn't competent," he looked at me steadily, "that would be a guardianship petition. It would go through the courts. It's not easy to obtain and it's not quick, but it does happen, and an existing financial authorization would certainly be cited as precedent for the petitioner." I told him everything I'd remembered over the past 2 days. The questions Carolyn had asked the nurse, the tone of her voice in the hallway, the loans that were never repaid, the real estate conversations I hadn't taken seriously enough. When I was finished, Dennis was quiet for a long moment. "Walter," he said, "I think you need to let me do some work before you leave this hospital." "Then start working," I said. He made a call that afternoon to an investigator he'd used on estate cases before, a woman named Brenda Cho, who Dennis described as meticulous and discreet. I never met Brenda Cho in person. I didn't need to. Her work arrived in Dennis's email 4 days later, and he read it to me over the phone, section by section, while I sat in my hospital bed and felt the floor of everything I thought I knew dropping away beneath me. Carolyn and Greg had consulted a guardianship attorney named Philip Greer 4 months ago. Not after my fall. 4 months before it. The consultation was documented in Greer's billing records, which Brenda had obtained through a source Dennis declined to specify. The nature of the consultation was listed as elder financial management, voluntary versus involuntary options. Involuntary. The words sat in my chest like a hot coal. There was more. Brenda had pulled financial records that, combined with the authorizations I'd signed, painted a picture I couldn't look away from. In the 14 months since I'd signed the financial authorization, Carolyn had used it to transfer $22,000 from my savings account in 4 separate transactions. Each one was just under the amount that would trigger automatic bank notification. Each one was coded as a bill payment. I had not been informed of any of them. The $30,000 loan, the $18,000 loan, $22,000 more that I hadn't even known was gone. My daughter had taken $70,000 from me, and she was still working on getting the house. But here's where the floor dropped completely. Brenda had also been looking at Greg. Greg Hoffman had been quietly consulting a divorce attorney for 7 months. The billing records showed 4 sessions. The notes, which Brenda had obtained through means that Dennis was again very vague about, indicated that Greg was planning to initiate divorce proceedings once, In the documented phrasing of his own consultations, the father-in-law situation was resolved and assets were liquid. The father-in-law situation. Carolyn wasn't just planning to take my house to secure her future. Greg was planning to take half of whatever Carolyn got and walk out the door. My daughter was as much his target as I was hers, and neither of them knew what the other was doing. And somehow both of them had decided that the obstacle between them and financial stability was a 64-year-old retired fire inspector who still had his faculties, his house, and his name on his own accounts. I asked Dennis to keep going. I was discharged on a Thursday. My wrist was in a cast, my ribs were wrapped, and I'd been given strict instructions to rest and avoid lifting for 4 weeks. Don Garrett picked me up and drove me home without being asked. He helped me inside, made sure I had food in the refrigerator, and as he was leaving, he stopped at the door. "You know," he said, without turning around, "Patricia used to say you were the most patient man she'd ever met. Said you could walk into a building that was about to fall apart and still find the one thing that could be fixed." I didn't say anything. I always thought she meant it as a compliment, he said. But I also think patience has a limit. He left. I sat in Patricia's chair by the front window, the chair she'd chosen because it caught the afternoon light perfectly, and I looked out at the yard and the street and the house across the way where Don was probably back at his kitchen window, keeping an eye out the way neighbors who actually care about you do. The quiet of the house pressed in around me. I'd missed this quiet every night in the hospital. Now it just felt like weight. My daughter had been in this house 3 times since I was admitted. I knew because Tyler had mentioned she'd called to check on my status, and Don had seen her car in the driveway twice. She had a key. She'd had a key for years. I'd given it to her so she could water the plants when Patricia and I traveled. We didn't travel anymore. I didn't take the key back because I didn't think I needed to. I called Dennis. "Tell me what I need to do," I said. The next 10 days were the most deliberate of my life. Dennis and I worked through every document, every account, every asset. The financial authorization was revoked, formally and in writing, with notice sent to the bank and copies filed with Dennis's office. A new will was drafted, replacing the one I'd made with Patricia, which had left everything in equal shares to Carolyn with standard provisions. The new will directed my estate to a scholarship fund at the Tennessee Fire and Life Safety Education Program, a cause I'd volunteered with for 12 years. Carolyn's name did not appear in it. A living trust was established, irrevocable, with Dennis as trustee. The house, my savings, my investment accounts, all of it folded into the trust, in a structure that Dennis described as about as bulletproof as these things get. Any attempt to challenge it on grounds of my competency would run directly into the cognitive evaluation I'd voluntarily taken at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where a neuropsychologist had spent 2 hours assessing my memory, judgment, and executive function and declared me, in precise clinical language, fully intact. I also had a conversation with Dennis about the $70,000. The 2 loans were documented with promissory notes. The $22,000 taken without my knowledge or consent was another matter. Dennis consulted with a colleague who specialized in financial elder abuse. The colleague used the phrase actionable in a way that was not reassuring for Carolyn. I told Dennis I wasn't ready to go that route yet. I wanted to look my daughter in the eye first. The meeting I called was framed as a family lunch at my house. I told Carolyn I was feeling better and wanted to see Sophie and catch up now that I was home. She agreed without hesitation, which told me she hadn't yet discovered the revoked authorization, which meant the bank had handled the notification exactly as I'd requested. She arrived on a Saturday with Greg and Sophie. Sophie ran to me immediately, the way 4-year-olds do, without hesitation or hidden motive, and I held her as carefully as my wrapped ribs allowed, and reminded myself that nothing that was about to happen was about her. I'd asked Dennis to come at 1 o'clock. It was noon when Carolyn arrived. I gave them an hour. We sat in the living room. Greg was restless in the way that people are restless when they're carrying something. Carolyn was warm in a way that felt practiced, asking about my wrist, my ribs, my sleep, complimenting the casserole Don's wife had dropped off that was sitting on the counter. I watched her the way I used to watch a building I was about to cite, looking for the gap between the surface and what was underneath. At 5 minutes past 1, Dennis knocked at the door. Carolyn's expression shifted when she saw him. Not dramatically, Just the micro adjustment of someone recalibrating their read of a situation. "Dad, I didn't know we were having other guests." "Dennis is my attorney," I said. "He's here because what I want to talk about today is a legal matter as well as a family matter." Greg put his phone face down on the cushion beside him. A small movement, significant. We settled at the dining room table, Sophie occupied with a tablet in the living room where I could see her. Dennis set a manila folder on the table but didn't open it. He had the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly how strong his hand was. I looked at my daughter. I'd been rehearsing what to say for 10 days, and in the end, I threw out all of it and just started talking. I told her I knew about Philip Greer. I told her I knew about the 4 consultations, the billing records, the phrase involuntary options. I watched the color shift in her face the way it shifts in a building when the air pressure changes before a flashover, that moment just before everything becomes uncontrollable. She started to speak. I kept going. I told her I knew about the $22,000. I said the number slowly. The way you read a citation number in an official report, clearly and without emotion, so there is no confusion about what is documented. I told her I knew that each transfer had been kept deliberately under the notification threshold. "That's not," she started. "I'm not finished," I said. I hadn't used that tone with Carolyn since she was 16 years old and I'd caught her lying to my face about where she'd been. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her I knew about the 2 loans, totaling $48,000, with signed promissory notes that had never resulted in a single repayment. I told her I knew she had used a medical event, the worst week of my life after losing her mother, to obtain authorizations she had intended to use to manage my assets against my wishes and without my knowledge. And then I paused, and I looked at Greg. "I also know," I said, "that you've been meeting with a divorce attorney since March." The silence in the room was complete. Sophie made a small sound from the living room, something about a cartoon character, and the contrast between that tiny, ordinary noise and what was happening at the table was almost unbearable. Greg looked at Carolyn. Carolyn looked at Greg, and in that look between them, I saw the entire architecture of their marriage exposed. 2 people who had been planning to use each other and hadn't known the other was doing the same thing, and now they were both sitting in my dining room with nowhere to go. Dennis opened the folder. He placed 3 documents on the table. The first was the notice of revocation for the financial authorization, stamped and dated. The second was a summary of the new estate plan, redacted to show only the trust structure and the removal of Carolyn as beneficiary, not the specific recipients. The third was a 1-page letter from Dennis's colleague in elder law, describing the nature of the $22,000 transfers and the legal exposure they represented. He slid them across the table one at a time. Carolyn didn't pick them up. She stared at the revocation notice, and I watched something in her face break apart slowly, not with drama, just with the quiet collapse of something that had been hollow at the center for longer than anyone had admitted. "I don't understand," she said finally. Her voice was very small. "Dad, I'm your daughter." "I know who you are," I said. "I was trying to help. I was trying to make sure that if something happened to you, things would be taken care of." "You were trying to make sure things would be taken care of," I agreed. "That's accurate. I'm less certain the things you meant were me." She flinched. It was the most honest reaction she'd had since she walked in the door. Greg was very still beside her. He'd gone the kind of pale that people go when they realize they've been caught at something by someone who knows more than they expected, and he was doing the math, visibly doing the math, about what I knew and what the presence of an attorney at this table meant. "The transfers are the piece that concerns my colleague most," Dennis said, addressing the table generally in a mild, professional tone that somehow made everything worse. "Unauthorized use of a financial power of attorney for personal benefit, particularly in increments designed to avoid notification triggers, constitutes financial elder abuse under Tennessee statute. The civil exposure is substantial. The question of whether to pursue a criminal referral is Mr. Briggs's decision entirely." Carolyn's hands were flat on the table. She was pressing them down, which is what people do when they're trying not to show that they're shaking. "Are you going to report me?" she asked me. "Not Dennis. Me." I looked at her for a long moment. At her hands on the table. At the woman who had sat next to me at Patricia's funeral and held my arm the whole way through, and who I had believed completely in that moment, and who I think even then was believing in me back, in whatever version of herself was still capable of that. "No," I said. "Not today." She let out a breath. "But understand what I'm telling you," I said. "The trust is in place. The will is changed. The authorization is revoked. None of that is negotiable, and none of it is reversible based on anything you say in this room. I didn't come to this decision quickly, and I didn't come to it in anger. I came to it because I spent 38 years in buildings that looked stable from the outside and were rotting on the inside. And I learned the only thing to do in that situation is document what's there and take appropriate action. What's documented here is what I found." I looked at Greg then, just briefly, long enough for him to understand that his presence in the folder was known and was a separate matter I was choosing, for now, to leave alone. "The loans," Dennis said, "will be formally called due. The repayment structure Mr. Briggs is prepared to offer is reasonable. It will be in writing and legally binding. If it's not accepted, the alternative is that the documented, unauthorized transfers become part of a civil filing, and the total amount at issue becomes significantly larger." Greg pushed back from the table and stood. He looked at Carolyn for a moment with an expression I can only describe as a man calculating his own exits. Then he went into the living room, said something quiet to Sophie about getting some air, and walked out the front door. We all heard his car start in the driveway. None of us mentioned it. Carolyn sat there for a long time after the door closed. I let her sit. Sophie had come to the doorway of the dining room and was looking at her mother with the attention of a child who can sense something is wrong but doesn't have words for it yet. "Mommy, okay?" Sophie said. Carolyn looked at her daughter, and the expression on her face in that moment was the first one I'd seen all afternoon that was entirely real. "I'm okay, baby," she said. "Go back to your show." Sophie went back. Carolyn looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Dennis, who looked back with professional neutrality. She looked at me. "I think," she said quietly, "that I've made some very bad decisions." "Yes," I said. "I think Greg has too." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "I didn't want to hurt you. There are things you say because they're true, and things you say because you need them to be true, and sometimes there's no clear line between those two things." I believed that sentence came from somewhere real in her. I also believed it didn't change what she'd done. "What I want," I said, "is for Sophie to grow up knowing her grandfather. I want that very much. That's the thing I actually want from this conversation." I paused. "What I need is for you to understand that I am not a problem to be managed or an asset to be liquidated. I am a person. I am your father, and I am fully capable of making every decision about my own life." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. "The repayment agreement," Dennis said gently, "is fair. Mr. Briggs structured it that way, deliberately." She nodded again. She didn't ask about the will. I think she already understood that conversation was over, at least for now. Some doors, once closed the way I'd closed that one, required more than a single afternoon to reopen. If they could be reopened at all. I walked her to the door when she left. Sophie hugged my legs carefully, aware of my ribs in the way children are when they've been told to be gentle, and I crouched down as far as I could manage and held her for a moment. Greg's car was gone. I didn't know where he'd driven to or what conclusions he was drawing alone in it, and I found I didn't much care. Whatever happened in that marriage was between them now. I'd removed myself as a factor in it. Dawn's kitchen light was on across the street. I went back inside and sat in Patricia's chair. The folder Dennis had left was on the coffee table. Outside the window, the street was settling into late afternoon, the kind of quiet that comes over Nashville on a weekend in October, when the leaves are turning and the tourists are in the honky-tonks on Broadway, and the neighborhoods feel like they belong to the people who actually live in is them. I thought about what Don had said before he left that first day, about patience having a limit. I thought about the badge that was in a case on the mantelpiece. 38 years of signing my name to documents that meant something, that recorded the truth of what was there, that held people accountable for the buildings they put other people inside. I'd cared about that work not because of the authority it gave me, but because I believed buildings should be honest, that what you saw on the outside should match what was actually holding the thing up. The same was true of families. The repayment agreement was signed 3 weeks later, with a family mediator present at Dennis's suggestion. Carolyn came alone. She'd retained a modest attorney who looked over the terms and advised her to sign. because the terms were, as Dennis had promised, genuinely fair. $700 a month, no interest. 62 months to pay back the full amount. A clause that said if circumstances changed materially, the schedule could be revisited by mutual agreement. She signed without argument. I signed across from her at a conference table in Dennis's office downtown, my cast finally off, my wrist still tender but functional. When it was done and the mediator was gathering papers, Carolyn looked at me over the table. "I started a therapist," she said. "About 2 weeks ago." I didn't say anything. She asked me to think about where the fear comes from. The fear about money, about security. She looked down at the table. "I've been thinking about it." "Good," I said. That was all I had for that, right then. She nodded. She picked up her bag. At the door, she paused, which seems to be the moment in most of the significant conversations in my life when the truest things get said. "Sophie wants to know if she can come help you rake leaves," she said. "She told me your yard has the best leaves." I looked at her. My daughter, 39 years old, standing in a doorway, telling me my granddaughter wanted to come rake leaves. I thought about all the mornings I'd stood in doorways of buildings I'd just sited, watching the owners absorb the reality of what had to change, and how some of them had come back to me months later to tell me the work was done. Not all of them, but some. "Saturday morning," I said, "tell her to bring her rain boots. The forecast says wet." Carolyn's face did something complicated that ended up looking, cautiously and without any promise, like relief. She left. I rode the elevator down with Dennis, who had been professionally quiet through most of the post-signing hour and who said, as we stepped out into the Nashville afternoon, "You were more generous than you needed to be." "I know," I said. "Is that a regret?" I thought about Sophie's boots, about Patricia's chair catching the afternoon light, about Don Garrett watching from across the street and knowing, without being told, exactly when to show up. "No," I said. "It's not. There's a version of this story that ends with the satisfaction of a door closing completely. And I won't pretend I didn't want that version. In the hospital, lying awake counting the hours my daughter wasn't calling, I wanted the clean ending, the full stop, the building condemned and shuttered, and everyone clear of it. But I'd spent my whole career in the real world of buildings, not the theoretical one. And the real world of buildings is that most of them can be brought up to code if someone is willing to do the work. The work is hard, and it takes time, and sometimes you get halfway through, and the structure underneath is worse than anyone thought, and the whole thing has to come down anyway. Sometimes it doesn't. Sophie came on Saturday. She was wearing yellow boots, not rain boots specifically, but close enough, and she had opinions about which leaves were the best for jumping in and which were the boring ones. And she explained these opinions to me in great detail for approximately 45 minutes while we worked. I let her do most of the jumping. My ribs appreciated this arrangement. Carolyn sat on the porch with her hands around a coffee mug, watching, not talking much, just sitting in the October light in the yard she'd grown up in, watching her daughter run through the leaves her grandfather had raked into piles in the house that was now mine alone, in every way that mattered and in every way that was documented. I didn't know what the future of that looked like yet. Didn't know if trust was something we could rebuild or something that, once taken apart this way, stayed in pieces. But I knew that a 64-year-old retired fire inspector was standing in his own yard on a clear October morning in East Nashville, with full cognitive function, a living trust, an irrevocable estate plan, and a granddaughter in yellow boots who had just declared a particular pile of red maple leaves to be, in her professional 4-year-old opinion, absolutely perfect. That was enough. That was more than enough. Some things can be salvaged, some things can't. Knowing the difference is the whole job.